Today we are in the fifth part. This is part 5 of this 6-part series called Right in the Eye. And if you're here today and you fall asleep in the middle of the message and then you wake up and people are like, dude, that was pretty good. You can always watch the video at our website, brookviewchurch.com, and this message and several years worth of past messages are there, and they're free, and you can pass those along. Because sometimes during a message you think, well, this doesn't apply to me, right? But this totally applies to my mother-in-law. And so you can always pass along the link and then hope for the best. Today I want to start with a question that you would absolutely expect a pastor to ask. So this is totally predictable, and I know that, but this is a great question. What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person do you want to be? Now, we don't have time to think about that because we're busy. But since you have a few seconds here this morning, what kind of person do you want to be? Like when your friends are talking about you when you're not around, and they do. You know, you leave the office and everybody's still there, and they talk about you, and they do. Or you're leaving a family gathering, right, and everybody's waving. They're like, bye, as you drive off, and they're looking through the window, and you see them all around the table. As soon as you pull out of the driveway, they're talking about you, right? So what do you want them to say? What kind of person do you want to be? And what if you decided, this is crazy, you decided to be an extraordinary person? Now, when I say extraordinary, I do not mean extraordinary at something. You may be extraordinary at something. So many of you are extraordinary at something. And we all know people that are extraordinary at something, and yet they are far from extraordinary people, right? They're extraordinary at something, and like they know they're really good at it, and it turns out they're not all that cool to be around. They're all about themselves, they're self-centered, and because they're so good at something, they're totally into themselves. And so we see them, and it's just like, okay, yeah, you're extraordinary at that, but you're not an extraordinary person because, see, no one wants to be around you. So here's what I'm saying. What if you and I decided that we were going to be extraordinary? You're going to be an extraordinary employee. You're going to be an extraordinary boss. You're going to be an extraordinary husband. I mean, what if your wife said about you whenever you're not around, your wife said about, you know what, my husband, I'll tell you what, I feel like with that man, I won the lottery. My husband, he is just an extraordinary person. Or like, you wouldn't believe it. My wife is just an extraordinary person. Or, oh man, my son is such an extraordinary person. Like, really? My daughter is an extraordinary person. So, and Kate, this is like a sappy dad pastor thing. So, like, forgive me for a second. And the rest of you, this isn't for you, so just tune this out. But Kate, I'm serious about this. I don't say this enough, and I can't say it enough. But I'm really proud. I'm proud of the person that you are. It's the person that you are. And people will ask about you all the time. What's up with Kate? How's Kate? What's going on with Kate? And after I fumble around for like a long time, I usually try to I spit something out. It sounds like this. Like, Kate is good at lots of stuff. She's good at lots of stuff. She is. But the thing about Kate is she's an extraordinary person. And so I couldn't be more proud of who you are, the person that you are. Okay, the rest of you can tune back in. What if we all decided to be extraordinary people? What if when people talked about you, it sounded like this? Man, I have this friend. I have this friend, and she is an extraordinary person. Or he is the most extraordinary person. Or I have this neighbor, just like the most extraordinary person. I mean, what if you and I decided that whatever roles we play, and we all play different roles, whatever roles we play, we were going to be extraordinary? Here's the thing. See, you could do that. Like, regardless of what talent you have or don't have, regardless of what opportunities you get or you don't get, regardless of what training you do or do not have, you can actually decide to be an extraordinary person. In fact, like here's a challenging thought for you. What if, like, for a whole week, like this coming week, okay, not your whole life, because that's like overwhelming. That's like too big. But what if for a week you decided every time you make a decision, like every time you're tempted, every time you're asked to do something, every time you interacted with your mom or your dad or your kids or siblings or friends or whatever, what if at every single juncture you asked this question? You said, what would an extraordinary person do? Now, I've been living with this for a few weeks, so I've been like thinking about this message, and it's been coming up, and it's been on my mind for a while, and here's what I've realized. This is like a really challenging question. And I kind of had this in my face the last week and a half or so. About a week ago, both Kate and Jen were out of town, and people were like, dude, you're batching it. And I'm like, no, I got Brooklyn's here, man. I got an 11-year-old daughter. I'm not batching it. So it's just like Brooklyn and I for a week. And so we had this really cool, like really intense, just few days of kind of one-on-one together. And I found myself face to face with my shadow side. Because I can be, and I know you guys can't fathom this, but I can be intense, and I can be selfish, and I can be grumpy. And so, like, I got all this junk in me. And so I was thinking about this, like, unique time that Brooke and I had together, and I was asking myself, man, like, what would an extraordinary father do? And when I asked that question, when it would come up, it was interesting because, you know what? I knew. If I asked the question, I knew. I knew what an extraordinary father would do, and several times it was not what I was about to do. And so asking the question was really a wake-up for me because I had this opportunity that I don't get all that often, just days and days of one-on-one time with my 11-year-old, just to pour into her. And because I asked the question, several times it became very clear what I should do. And I was able to step into some really cool dad-daughter stuff. And I don't want to brag or anything, but I was extraordinary. And so, do you know what Brooklyn said? You know what Brooklyn said? Nothing. She said nothing. Like she didn't even notice, right? And if you're a parent, like that's how parenting goes, right? Like when you actually get it right in those few moments in life where you like get it right, the kids are like, well, of course, that's what moms and dads do. Okay, so back to the point, the question. What would an extraordinary person do? And if you ask that question in a particular context, often, not always, but often, you know. You know. So what if you ask that question at every juncture that you can think of it this week? Now, it could be some of you are going, yeah, well, whatever, pastor. And like, I don't need that. I don't want to be extraordinary. I just want to be comfortable, and I want to be happy. And I'm not sure being extraordinary is something that I even really want. And so I just want to ask, like, if you're thinking that, are you sure? Are you sure? Because I think you do. I think you do. And I think you do because if you think about it, that's what you want for other people. That's what you want for the people around you. I mean, if your son or your daughter came to you and said, Mom, Dad, I want to be an extraordinary person. Not necessarily extraordinary at something, although that would be cool. But I want to be an extraordinary son. I want to be an extraordinary daughter. I want to be an extraordinary friend. I want to be an extraordinary employee. Someday, if I get the chance, I would want to be an extraordinary boss. I don't think that you would say to them, okay, now you just hold right on because I didn't raise you to be extraordinary. Don't go there. Let's not start talking like that. I mean, if you heard your boss wanted to be an extraordinary boss, like really a great boss, isn't that what you'd want? Like, would you hear that and think, I'm just going to march right into her office and say, hey, I heard you were thinking about trying to be an extraordinary boss. Like, don't do it. Whatever you do, just be average. Don't support us too much. Don't try to understand what we're feeling and what we're going through. Don't try to equip us for our job. Don't be too encouraging. Whatever you do, always take the credit and don't give us any credit. Be kind of distant, be kind of disinterested. Just be an average boss, right? Whatever you do, don't get all extraordinary on us. Or, okay, with your spouse, right? Like, honey, I married you because you're not extraordinary. So don't go getting all extraordinary. Like, I mean, if you think about it, you want to be around extraordinary people. You do. You want to be around people that are extraordinary. You love it if you're working for an extraordinary boss. It's amazing when you have extraordinary employees. You are so deeply blessed if you have extraordinary parents. Now, some of you I know have extraordinary friends, and you don't know where you would be without them. And so I just go, come on, man. Why would you not want to be extraordinary? And here's the good news that, again, with a pastor, you all knew was coming. But here's the good news. This is the invitation of your Heavenly Father. This is always the invitation. That if you trust Him and you follow Him, He will make you into an extraordinary person. He will bless people through you in extraordinary ways. That's His goal. That's His design for you. But in order to step into that life, you can't just settle for average. You can't just settle for ordinary. We're in this series. This is part 5, again, of a 6-week series called Right in the Eye. And it's based on the book of what? Judges. And today we're going to look at a guy who was just flat plain afraid to be extraordinary. But before we dive into his story, I want us to get caught up a little bit, a little context. Judges takes place in a certain unique time period. Okay, so the nation of Israel had been freed from slavery in Egypt. And Moses had led them on this long, difficult journey right up to the promised land. And then Moses died, and his right-hand man, Joshua, led them into the land. And for their first 330 years in the land, there would be no king for Israel. Israel was intended to be an extraordinary nation, set apart, a nation like no other nation. Every other nation had a king. Every other nation had a king. But Israel would have no king because who would be their king? God. God had given them His law, and He would be their king. And they would follow Him, and they would follow His law, and they would be an extraordinary nation. God would make them a light to all the other nations. They'd be extraordinarily strong and healthy and kind to one another. And God would bless them, and He would bless their crops and their economy, and He would strengthen their army to be able to withstand enemy nations. They'd become a nation characterized by justice, a place where orphans and widows and disabled people would be loved, where the poor would be provided for, where neighbor would love neighbor, where family would love family, where justice would reign and crime would be virtually non-existent. And all the other nations then would look at them and they would say, wow, that's extraordinary. They really got it going on. Like, what is up with their God? Their God must be like the true God. Look at how He provides for them. Look at how He strengthens them. Look at the way they live in community and live in harmony with each other. Maybe we should think about worshiping their God. But as we all have a tendency to do, the Israelites, right, they would stop looking up, and they started looking around at all the other people around them and all the other nations and all the other cultures, and they just said, you know what, we're just going to live like them. We're going to treat each other like they treat each other. We're going to worship their gods, adopt their ways. We're going to ignore God's law and do the things that everybody else does just the way everybody else does them. And so they would go through this cycle again and again. They would disobey God. They would take their eyes off of him, start looking around at the other nations, copying the other nations. They would disobey God, and it would lead them to some kind of disaster. So they would cry out to God for help and cry out, and he would give them a deliverer, and he would give them deliverance. And they would say to God after that whole ordeal, man, did we learn our lesson? I mean, we should have listened to you the first time. We all see it now. We should have listened to you the first time, but God, we will never, ever do that again. And for a time, they'd start looking up again. But pretty soon, they'd start looking around at all the neighboring nations, and the cycle would start all over again. And the book of Judges ends with sort of a summary statement for this entire 330-year period. And this statement is the backdrop for this whole series, where the writer kind of sums up the whole thing and says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was what? Right in his own eyes. So we're walking through this period where there'd be cycle after cycle. Disobedience would lead to disaster, so they'd cry out to God, and he'd provide a deliverer, which was known as a judge, to lead them. And today we're going to look at the story of one particular judge, a guy named Gideon. Now last week, we looked at another judge. For those of you that were here, what was his name? Samson. Good. Good. That's good. It's always nice for me when somebody remembers something. Now, Samson, not a great story, right? Not a great story, very spicy. A lot of great takeaways for you and me. But Samson, not a great story, not a great judge. Gideon was actually a really good judge. And I want to tell you a little bit of his story, not his whole story. You can read that on your own, and I encourage you to do that. It starts in Judges chapter 6. I really hope that at some point you will, if you're not familiar with the story, just get in there and read it. But I'm just going to tell you the first part of his story because there's this tension. Gideon, like many of us, believed in God, but had just sort of become an ordinary person. He began to believe about himself and his world what himself and his world told him about himself and his world. And this is a fascinating story. Like God shows up and he kind of like grabs Gideon and he shakes him and he's like, what are you doing? Like, how did you become so ordinary? How is it that you forgot your destiny? How is it that you forgot that the Spirit of God rests on you and on these people? Wake up. I want you to realize who you are, and I want you to step into who I've created you and designed you to be. So here's how the story goes. Now, I'll read a little bit just to set the context, and then we're going to jump in specifically to stuff with Gideon. But this is Judges chapter 6. It says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Okay, so the Midianites were neighbors of the Israelites, and they'd been feuding for several years, and at this point in their history, the Midianites had the upper hand. And it was getting like bad for the Israelites. It says, because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. So the Israelites couldn't even live in their cities and in their towns because the Midianites just came in and invaded it all. And so the Israelites had to flee, and they were hiding and living in these really awful places. It says, whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. In fact, it says they camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So here we go. They had forsaken God. They had ignored God's law and worshipped other gods, foreign gods, the gods of other nations. And it turns out the Israelites were actually worshiping the gods of the Midianites. So for 7 years, God let the Midianites trample all over them. And we talked about this concept a few weeks ago, but you copy something and then you're captured by it. You copy something and then you're captured by it. You copy something and then you're captured by it. Like you freely walk into something and then you find later on you cannot freely walk out of it. Well, the nation had abandoned God in favor of the ways and the gods of the Midianites. And so finally God said, okay, all right, you want to live like the Midianites? Then have at it. And for 7 years, God gave his people over to the Midianites. So for 7 years, there's famine and being impoverished. 7 years, after 7 years of worshiping other gods, including the Midianite gods, there's captivity and there's poverty and there's famine. And the nation does what you and I've done when we find ourselves in a crisis because we ignored sound advice and did something stupid. They call the one whose rules they broke to come and save them from the consequences of breaking the rules that were set. And I think we've all done this, right, at one time or another. Mom, dad, right? I'm in the principal's office, right? I did what you told me not to do. You warned me. I did what and what you warned me would happen, happened. And now, Mom, Dad, I need you to come get me out of this. And I broke your rule. I know it was your rule, and I got myself into a mess. But I need you to come and get me out of it. We've all been there at some point. So that's Israel. They had to call the God who set the rule to come bail them out from all the consequences of breaking the rule. So the whole nation, the whole nation is on the phone with God. The nation is just like, okay, God, I promise. Okay, I promise if you will come down here, I'll never do this again. We all promise, don't we, guys? And they're all like, yeah, we promise. They're like, hear that, God? God, we need you to bail us out because this is not going well for us. Okay, so that's the nation of Israel. And they went through this thing over and over and over. Now here's where the cool thing you see again and again happens in the book of Judges. When the nation rebelled against God, and then the nation repented and turned back to God, guess what God did? He turned back to the nation. In fact, that's what God does. This is what God does with all of us again and again and again, because God is a God of mercy. But he's so merciful that he doesn't shield us from all of the consequences of our dumb decisions, because by not shielding us from the consequences, we see then where our dumb decisions lead. And we learn and we grow. And if we will turn back to God, he'll forgive us and he will begin to invade our lives once again. And he'll restore us to him and even begin to heal us from the brokenness that we have created by not listening to him. And you go, well, how many rounds of this do I get with God? I mean, how many rounds do I get before he's finally like, I'm done with you? How many rounds of this do I get with God? Here's the cool thing. As many rounds as you need. Because God's mercy never, ever, ever runs out. But he loves you too much not to let you face some of the consequences. So the nation of Israel is like, okay, God, we have had it. We've had it with all this. We repent, God. Would you do something for us? And that's when we meet Gideon. So here's how the story of Gideon starts. It says, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. So there's a lot of names in there that I don't even enjoy reading, but the key idea here is that he is threshing wheat, we're told, in a winepress. And that might not jump off the page. You go, whoa, that's crazy, man. What does that mean? To ancient Israelites, that would have jumped off the page because that was insane. Nobody would do that. When you thresh wheat, you need lots of wind Because so like you go up on hills or you go into a very windy open space. Because what happens is you take your pitchfork and you throw the wheat up in the air and the wind comes and it blows away all the chaff, which doesn't have much weight to it, and the grain falls to the ground. This is how you separate the good stuff from the bad stuff. You need the wind, but you have to be up high. You have to be in open spaces to do this. But the idea is they're so afraid of the Midianites, and Gideon is such a coward that along with all the other Israelites, they're trying to hide their wheat. So he's threshing wheat in a wine press, which was like a little hole in the ground, a place that does not make any sense. But he's terrified that he might be seen, and if he's seen by the Midianites, the big bad Midianites might come and take away even his little bit of wheat. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon's like, "Who are you talking to?" Okay, because I'm hiding. I'm scared and I'm hiding and I'm actually trying to thresh wheat in a wine press. It's ridiculous, actually. Like, mighty warrior? Are you kidding me? And before we move on from that, it could be this morning that some of you are in a very similar place because you've lost sight of who you are. You've lost sight of what God wants to do in your life. You've forgotten those moments when God has clearly broken through. Like you've forgotten all the times that God has answered your prayer, or you've forgotten the different times that God has been so good to you. Forgotten who you are and forgotten who God is. And so you've essentially just abandoned his unique call on your life. And you've just taken the persona of all of the people around you, the world around you, and you think like them, and you act like them, and you struggle like them. And so when a message like this comes to you, like "the Lord is with you, mighty warrior," you're just like, really? Really? Like, okay, do you know where I was last night? Like, have you been paying attention? Mighty warrior. Like, you know how far away from God I am? Do you know how far away I've drifted? The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. So Gideon says the same kind of thing that we do. He says, "Pardon me, my Lord." And he's so polite throughout this whole thing. "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us," okay, with the nation, "why has all this happened to us?" And this is a great question because this is a question that you've asked, I've asked, we all ask. It's like, God, if you're good, then why all the bad? God, if you're for me, then why does it feel like the world is against me? Why do I still not have a job? Why am I still single? Why can't we have children? What's going on with my health, God? Why can't the doctors fix this? Like, why, God? Why? For thousands of years, people have been asking God this question. And it's interesting because it does not appear that God is in the least bit offended. It turns out that this is often the question that leads us back into intimacy with God. Gideon continues. He says, "Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?'" He's like, since childhood, I've been hearing about all these miracles, the great things you've done, the great things you did. You freed our people from Egypt and all that goes with that. But Gideon's like, here we are, God, right now. Here I am, right now, oppressed. Why won't you do for me what you did for them? Your miracles for them are like inspiring and everything, but where's my miracle, God? Where's my miracle? Continues, but now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And he's like, so you know what? I mean, I appreciate the visit and everything, Angel, but maybe this is all just a bunch of hype. Because I'm not a mighty warrior, I'll tell you that. And so maybe God is not a mighty God. And it's not all like it used to be. And to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure that I believe those ancient stories anyway. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Am I not sending you? Gideon, you have everything you need to do what I'm calling you to do. See, I'm with you. I'm going before you. I'm going to prepare the way. So you have everything you need if you will just trust me and go." And this is where Gideon should go all William Wallace. You know William Wallace, right? He should go all William Wallace. He should rally the Israelites and get on his horse and ride up and down in front of them. And then at some point he should yell, "Freedom!" Right? And they should all march in and fight against the Midianites. But instead, here's how Gideon responds. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh." I love this because this is what we do. "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And so if you remember, Israel was divided into 12 tribes. So Gideon is from the tribe of Manasseh, not a significant tribe. And he says, "I'm from the weakest clan in Manasseh, and I'm like the least in my family." Okay, translated. God, I went to an alternative high school, and I barely finished, and I don't have any skills, and I don't have any money, and I'm a nobody, God, and I'm not married, and I can't even get a girlfriend, and I haven't even figured out Twitter. I still use Facebook, and I only have 4 friends. It's my mom and my dad and my 2 brothers. And speaking of my brothers, one of them went to Stanford. Okay, and the other one started a business right out of high school, and now he's wealthy beyond belief, and he's got this huge house and this awesome car and this hot wife, and look, I'm a nobody. And you're coming down telling me that I'm a mighty warrior. Really? I can't save Israel. I don't even know what you're talking about. It says, so the Lord answered, "Oh, then never mind. I must be at the wrong house." I mean, yeah, not so much. But this is a story of a man that had lost his way. He'd lost sight of who he is. And this happens. It happens. And when it happens, we need a wake-up call. And this is where I wish that God would do something, even right here, right now, this morning. I wish that God would do something among us in my heart, in your heart, something that no message can do. In fact, as I've been kind of prepping this week, my prayer this entire week has been just God, if we could just for a moment close our eyes and then open our eyes and see ourselves, get a glimpse of ourselves as you see us. God, how different our lives could be. Gideon, do you feel like you're a warrior? No. Well, you are. I'm not. You are. I'm not. You are. I'm not. Well, so Gideon, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe your estimation of you? Or are you going to believe God's estimation of you? And as you think about you, I just want to ask you this. What are you going to believe? I mean, are you going to believe your estimation of you? Because I wonder how you even arrived at your estimation of you. Could it be that you just let everybody else around you tell you who you are? And if so, just throwing it out there, what if they're wrong? I mean, what if you've been around the wrong people, or their estimation of you is totally wrong? And what if you look at your life, you realize you've just tried your best to look like them, and then you let them all along the way tell you who you are? So let me just throw out a crazy idea to you. What if you have worked so hard to be like everybody else that you don't even realize what you're actually capable of? What if you spent your life just going along with everybody else, just living your life the way everybody else lives, dating the way that they date, spending money the way they spend money, just dreaming as little as everybody else dreams. And I think this is kind of hard to grasp, but what if, this is really hard to grasp, but what if God sees something extraordinary in you? And I look at this and go, this is so huge. It's just like, God, if you could just give us a glimpse of that, if you could just open our eyes, even for a moment, so that we could see ourselves the way you see us. Man, that could change everything. So here's my prayer for us today. God, open our eyes to see ourselves the way you see us. And this is one of my favorite things that happens like when we do baptisms. And by the way, we have one coming up. And if you haven't been baptized and you're interested or you're not even sure if you're ready, but you think you might be, write it down on your communication card, drop it in the basket. We'll get a hold of you and figure it out. I'll walk through that with you. But one of my favorite things about when we do a baptism service is we ask people to share why they've decided to be baptized. And people tell their stories, and it's so amazing because inevitably it includes this piece. There's this realization. There's this moment or period of time when a realization comes. It's like their eyes are opened and they finally see it, and it's like, oh, I see it. I see it. God, like, you love me. Like Jesus, like the cross wasn't just like for humanity in general. It was for me. Like, you love me. You've been with me my whole life. You're for me, and you have a purpose and a plan for me. You care about my relationships and my money and my expressions of intimacy. God, you care about all of that because you care about me. And because of that, there's this opportunity for me to be extraordinary, not necessarily extraordinary at something, but an extraordinary version of me because I'm rightly connected to you, God. And people are like, oh, I see it. Like, I finally see it. I see it. I get it. There's this really cool passage in the book of Corinthians where the Apostle Paul basically says, here's what you can look forward to. In the end, we will see everything as it really is. We will see God as he is. We will see ourselves as he sees us. And it'll change everything. It will make everything complete. I mean, I love this passage. It's so beautiful to me. Paul writes, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. One day, we're going to see in full what we now see in part. God is bringing all of this to a beautiful completion. And Paul compares it to like growing up, how a kid just can't understand stuff. They don't get it. You become an adult and you see it. He says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. It's like our current understanding of all of it is so infantile. But one day God will enable us to see all of it. He concludes, he says, for now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So here's Gideon with the angel. And the angel that can see all of it is going, oh, if you could just see it, Gideon. Like if you could only see the way that God sees you. Like, come on, Gideon. Like, see it. Just for a second, see it. Come on. Because if you could see the way God sees you, you would step out of here and you would be and do something extraordinary. And so finally God breaks through. And it says, the Lord answered Gideon, I will be with you. I guess the question is for Gideon, the question is for me, the question is for you, the question is mom, the question is college student, the question is business owner, the question is department supervisor, the question is high school student, the question is dad, the question is, will you be with me? I will be with you, but will you be with me? Because I'm with you, Gideon, God's saying. In fact, I've been with the nation all this 330-year period of this roller coaster saga. I've been with you the whole time. And Gideon, I want to do something extraordinary through you. I'm with you. The question is, will you be with me? And that's why I think just the main idea of the book of Judges and really this entire series is so important, because you have all kinds of freedom. We all have all kinds of freedom. You can do what you want, when you want, with whom you want. You can do whatever is right in your own eyes. But if that's all you ever do, you just end up like everybody else. And you'll miss the incredible opportunity that God is extending to you to become and to live a life that's extraordinary. And so this is the defining moment in Gideon's life. Will he keep living like everybody else, or will he, through faith, step out and be extraordinary? Will he look at himself and see himself and his situation through a different lens? Will he recognize God is with me, and God is in me, and God is for me? And this is always the battle. This is what is so hard for us to see. In fact, 1,300 years later, another Jewish man, again the Apostle Paul, the one who wrote, "For now we see only as a reflection in a mirror." He also wrote a letter to Christians living in Rome. It was a very dangerous place to be a Christian, if you know history very well, because the Christians refused to worship the Emperor Nero as a god. They had another king, and they only worshiped their king, King Jesus. And so Nero hunted them down, and he tortured them, and he executed them. And like Gideon, they were all asking, why is this happening, God? And so Paul wrote to them to say, if you could only see it, don't you understand? If God is for us, he said, if God is for us, who can be against us? The same thing that God had said to Gideon. Gideon, I know you don't see yourself as a warrior. I know you went to alternative high school. I know you aren't very influential. I know things aren't going very well for you. I know you're hiding. I know the last thing you're thinking is, yeah, mighty warrior. But I'm telling you, I see you differently. And I just want you to begin to step into what I see. To step out of the way you've been viewing yourself for all these years. So Paul is writing to Christians who are watching their friends die every day. Can you imagine? And they're thinking, well, how do we know God is with us? Well, why should we believe God is for us? Nero is burning us alive, and he's throwing us to the lions. This is an absolute disaster. How do we know? How can we possibly know that God is for us? And just like Gideon, but we haven't seen a miracle for centuries, God. I hear about Egypt. That was a long time ago. Why should we believe God is for us? And so to the Christians in the first century facing all of these trials, and to all of us that would hear the story of Jesus through them, through their legacy, Paul, anticipating our objections, says, don't look at your current circumstances to determine God's concern for you. Don't be fooled by the mess around you. Don't infer his presence based on the bad things that you see. You need to focus on one thing, and don't ever divert your eyes from it. He writes, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? He said, you know how you can wake up every day and know that God is for you? It's not by looking around at all the Midianites. It's not by looking around at your job or your lack of job or the promotion you're not getting. It's not by looking around at all your problems. You can wake up every day and know that God is with you, in you, and for you, because 2,000 years ago, he gave his son for you. That's how valuable you are to God. And now, like, here's economics 101. The value of a thing is the price it will bring. You want to know exactly how valuable something is? You put it on the market. You find out. You test it. You sell it. You see what price you can actually get for it, right? You want to find out how much your house is worth? I mean, you can hire a real estate expert to tell you, but you don't know until you actually put it on the market and see what somebody's willing to pay for it. Well, here's what the Apostle Paul is saying to all of us. He's saying, you are so valuable to God as a person, as an individual, as his child, that he equated you to the price of his son. So wake up every day and live knowing how valuable you are. God came to Gideon to shake him, like to wake him up and say, I know who you are, but I don't see you like you see you. The story of Gideon, it ends like this, kind of interesting. He's like scared to death, right? He's cowering, he's just terrified, scared to death. And I hope some of you like read the rest of this story for yourself and go find it in Judges 6. It's awesome. He's scared to death, and God is calling him to deliver all of Israel, right? To defeat the Midianites. So what does he do? Well, he like sneaks out one night and he destroys one idol. And then he sneaks back home and hides, right? And he's like, how about that, God? Right? I knocked down an idol. Like, how am I doing, God? And God's like, well, that's a start. That's a start. Good job, Gideon. So Gideon takes this baby step and he asks, what would someone do if he knew God was with him? And so he starts by destroying one idol. And then things kind of get going. And from there, it is just a fantastic story about a man who's scared to death, who begins to step into what God had for him. He stops letting everybody else tell him who he is, and for the first time in his life, he allows God to tell him who he is. Writer and pastor Stephen Furtick, he talks about how powerful this can be. He says, it's dangerous to think more highly of yourself than you ought, which is true. It's dangerous to think more highly of yourself than you ought. He says, but it's equally dangerous to think less of yourself than God does. It's equally dangerous to think less of yourself than God does. So maybe you and I could live very differently if we woke up every day and asked, what would an extraordinary person do? Like, what would an extraordinary you do? What would an extraordinary version of you do? Because that's the life that you've been invited into. That was the destiny that Israel had been invited into. That was the destiny that Samson and Gideon were both invited into. And Samson, as we saw last week, just threw it away because he couldn't keep his eyes off of the world around him. Gideon, on the other hand, he baby stepped into it, but he stepped into it. And God used him to do extraordinary things. And my prayer coming into today, just all week, has been like, God, would you do what no human being can do? Would you do what certainly no sermon or message could do? But God, would you somehow like reach into our hearts, and would you open our eyes and enable us, even if only for a moment, to see ourselves the way you see us? Like, help us, God, become extraordinary people. Extraordinary moms and extraordinary bosses and extraordinary friends and extraordinary employees and extraordinary brothers and sisters and neighbors. Because that's awesome.